The oven was hot by 4 in the morning, and her hands were already in the dough. Hannah Rue Coyle worked the mass on the board with the heels of both palms, folding it toward her, turning it a quarter, folding it again. The kitchen behind the boarding house was small and low and smelled of yeast and ash. Outside the one window, there was nothing yet but a gray line where the prairie met the sky, and the sound of a rooster that belonged to somebody else. She'd been awake since 3. She would be awake until dark. That was the shape of the days now, and she had decided some months back that a shape was better than no shape at all. 12 loaves. She counted them in her head as she worked, the way another woman might count prayers. 12 loaves meant 6 for the boarding house table and 6 for the market, and if the market went well, 6 loaves meant flour for Monday and coal oil for the lamp and something set aside in the tin behind the stovepipe. The market had not gone well in 9 weeks. She did not let herself think about that while her hands were busy. She had learned that trick from her mother, who had crossed from Ohio with a crock of sourdough starter wrapped in a wool shawl and had kept it alive through 2 hard winters and 1 dead child by refusing to think about anything but the next feeding. Flour and water and warmth. Flour and water and warmth. There were worse things to build a life on. The crock sat on the shelf above the flour barrel, brown and heavy and chipped at the lip. Hannah fed it every morning before she fed herself. By 6, the loaves were in. By 7, the whole back of the boarding house smelled like a house where somebody was loved. Dorcas Pell came down in her wrapper and stood in the doorway with her arms folded and did not say anything for a while, which was the way Dorcas Pell said most things. "You are going to the market again." "I am." Dorcas Pell looked at the loaves cooling on the rack, 12 of them, brown and steaming and honest. "Suit yourself." Hannah wrapped 6 of them in clean sacking and set them in the basket. She put on the gray dress because it was the one that showed the least flour. She tied the bonnet under her chin. Then she carried the basket out into the cold, bright morning of the 12th of October, 1884, and walked the 4 blocks into the town of Bell Harrow, Dakota Territory, where nobody would meet her eyes. The market ran along the north side of the square, under the cottonwoods that the town had planted 20 years back and watered by hand until they took. Egg women. A man with winter squash piled like cannonballs, a bohemian family selling sausage and horseradish and speaking so little English that they had never learned what Hannah was supposed to be. She set her board across 2 crates near the end of the row. She laid out the 6 loaves in 2 lines of 3. She set a small tin cup beside them for coin, and she stood with her hands folded at her waist, and she waited. A woman she had known for 2 years walked past with her basket and looked at the squash. A man she had fed at the boarding house table 19 times looked at the ground. The bohemian woman bought a loaf, as she did most weeks, and paid 5 cents and said something kind in a language Hannah did not have, and Hannah thanked her in the language she did have, and they smiled at each other the way 2 people smile across a river. By 11, she had sold 2. That was when the rider came in off the north road, and the market noticed him the way a room notices a lamp. Josiah Amos Kell was 51 years old and owned more grass than any man in the county. He ran cattle on the flats above the Bad River breaks and wintered them in a valley he had bought for almost nothing in '79, and he employed 19 men year-round and 40 in the fall. He wore a coat that was good and old. He did not wear a pistol into town. He came into Bell Harrow perhaps twice a month, spoke to 4 people, bought what he came for, and rode out, and the town spent the rest of the week talking about him. Hannah knew all of this the way you know weather. She had never spoken a word to him. He tied his horse at the rail and walked the market row slowly, hands behind his back, looking at things. He bought a sack of the winter squash and had it set aside. He stopped at the sausage and bought more than 1 man could eat. He came down the road toward the end, where the crates were, and Hannah looked at her loaves and not at him, because she had learned in 9 weeks that looking at people first was a way of asking for something, and she had stopped asking. His boots stopped at her board. She looked up. He had a broad, weathered face and gray in his beard and eyes that did not move away when hers arrived. That was the whole of it. It should not have been anything. But she had been looked past and looked through and looked around for 200 and some days, and a man looking straight at her went through her like heat. That is good bread. It is. She had not meant it to come out flat like that. It came out flat like that. He seemed to consider it. How much? 5 cents. He put a silver dollar on the board. Hannah did not touch it. I have 4 loaves. They come to 20 cents. He looked at the loaves and then at the dollar and then at her again. Then I will take 4 loaves and you will owe me 80 cents, and I will come back next Saturday to collect it in bread. Something in the row went quiet. Not the whole market, just the near part of it, the part that could hear. Hannah wrapped the 4 loaves in sacking, one at a time, and set them in the crook of his arm. Her hands were steady. She was glad of that later. What is your name? Hannah Coyle. He nodded once as though she had confirmed something he had already been told and had not believed. Josiah Kell. Then he walked back down the row with 4 loaves under his arm, past every person who had spent the morning not seeing her, and he mounted and rode north, and the market began to talk before he was out of the square. She carried the empty basket home and put the silver dollar in the tin behind the stovepipe and sat down on the edge of the bed in the small room off the kitchen, and only then did she put her face in her hands. It was not gratitude. She had not been given anything. She had sold 4 loaves at a fair price, and she owed the man 80 cents. That was exactly what it was. The trouble had a beginning, and she knew the date of it. The 19th of January, 1884, at 4:20 in the afternoon, when Thomas Coyle stopped breathing in the bed she was now sitting on. He had been 44. He had hauled for the Farmers Cooperative for 6 years, taking wheat by wagon from the Bell Harrow scale house down to the rail siding at Culver Bend, 22 miles each way, sometimes twice in a day when the weather held. He had a bad chest from a winter in the mines at Deadwood before she married him, and he never once said so. In November, the cooperative closed its books for the season and found itself short, 900 bushels short, spread across the fall, gone somewhere between the scale house in town and the siding at the rail. 900 bushels was a great deal of money in a county where money was thin, and money that goes missing wants a name attached to it. Emmett Vance ran the scale house. Emmett Vance also ran the mercantile and held paper on 11 farms and sat on the board of the cooperative. And it was Emmett Vance who stood up in the meeting at the Odd Fellows Hall in the first week of December and said, with great regret, that the hauling had been done by one man, and that one man had been seen at the siding without a witness on more than one occasion, and that he was sorry to be the one to say it out loud. Thomas rode into that hall with a fever of 102 and stood up and said it was not true. He said he could show every load. He said his wife kept the book. They let him talk. Then they went home and believed Emmett Vance, because Emmett Vance held their paper and Thomas Coyle held nothing. 6 weeks later, Thomas was dead, and a dead man cannot be tried, and a town that cannot try a man will settle for trying his widow. They did not call her a thief. That was the thing about Bell Harrow. Nobody ever said a word to her face in 9 months. They simply stopped standing near her at church. They stopped buying. They crossed the street with a small pleasant nod which was worse than spitting, and she had told herself that many times, and she would learn before the winter was out that it was not true. She still had the book. It sat in the bottom of her trunk under the quilt her mother made, a hauling ledger bound in green cloth, and in it, in her own hand, was every load Thomas ever carried. The date. The wagon weight empty. The wagon weight loaded. The figure the scale house gave. The figure the weighmaster at Culver Bend gave, with the siding stamp beside it, a small purple circle with a number in the middle. She had kept it because she kept everything. She'd been keeping the account since the 2nd month of her marriage, because Thomas could read a horse in a sky and a woman better than most men, and could not read a column of figures without his ears going red. She had brought the book to the meeting in December. Nobody asked for it. She had brought it to Emmett Vance in February and set it on the counter of the mercantile and asked him to look at the 4th column beside the 3rd. He had looked at her for a long moment with something almost like pity. And then he had said that grief made people cling to strange things, and that the cooperative considered the matter closed out of respect for the dead, and that if she needed credit, she should come to him and not be proud about it. Then, he sold her flour at 9 cents a pound, which was 2 cents above what he sold it to anybody else, and he did it with a smile, and he wrote it in his book, and she paid it, and she went home and fed the starter. The following Saturday, Josiah Kell came back and bought 80 cents of bread and stood at the end of the board for a quarter of an hour, not saying much. He asked what she used for the sour. She told him. Her mother carried it from Ohio in a crock, wrapped in wool, fed on the road with flour, begged at farmhouses, and it was older than Hannah was and had never been let die. He said that was the first thing anybody had told him in that town in a year that he wanted to hear twice. The Saturday after that he came with a wagon and a hand named Ned Shifley, a boy of about 19 with a bad haircut and a good face, and he bought 11 loaves, and Hannah had to explain that 11 loaves was more than she had made, and he said then he would take 9 and she should consider making more. The Saturday after that he asked whether she could bake for 40 men. She said that depended on whether the 40 men wanted bread or wanted to be flattered. He laughed. It came out of him rough and surprised, the way a laugh comes out of a man who has not used one in a while, and 2 women at the egg table turned around to look, and Hannah felt her face go warm for the first time since January. She began riding out to the valley on Wednesdays. It started as a delivery and became something else, in the way that things do when 2 people are careful and slow. She would drive the borrowed cart up the north road with the loaves in a wooden box under canvas, and come over the rise and see the whole of it laid out below, the long, low house, the bunkhouse, the corrals, the cottonwoods along the creek turning yellow, and the cattle scattered on the flats like scripture. The cook at the outfit was a man named Prosper, who had one working eye and a great deal of opinion, and who took one bite of her bread and then took another, and then went out behind the bunkhouse and stood there for a while. She learned the place slowly. She learned that the house had 9 rooms and that Josiah Kell used 3. She learned that there had been a wife, Eliza, dead 8 years of a fever that took her in 11 days, and a daughter, Mary Ellen, dead the same week, age 6. She learned this not from him, but from Ned Shifley, who told her while helping her lift the box down, in the flat, unguarded way of a boy who has not yet learned which things are heavy. The first honest conversation happened in the last week of November, with the first snow coming. She had stayed too long. The sky had gone the color of a nickel, and Josiah Kell came out of the barn and looked at it and said she was not driving 22 miles into that, and she said she had 6 loaves proving at the boarding house, and he said the loaves would be there tomorrow, and so would she if she was sensible, and that was the closest either of them had come to an argument. She stayed. Prosper fed them at the long table in the kitchen with the hands, and afterward the hands went out to the bunkhouse, and the wind came up, and the 2 of them sat by the stove in the front room among the 9 rooms, and the snow began. He asked her about Thomas. She had not talked about Thomas to anybody, not once. There had been nobody to talk to. She talked for an hour. She told him that Thomas Coyle had been a poor provider and a good man, and that those 2 things had lived in him without ever once fighting. She told him about the chest and the way he hid it, and the way she used to hear him at 3 in the morning holding his breath so as not to wake her. She told him about the meeting at the Odd Fellows Hall, and about 102 degrees of fever, and a man standing up in a room full of neighbors to say a true thing that nobody wanted. She told him she had the book. He was quiet a long while. The stove ticked. "Why did you never take it to the county? The county seat is at Fort Pierre. That is 110 miles. I would need a lawyer, and I have no money for a lawyer, and the only man who would lend me money is the man the book accuses." He turned his cup in his hands. "That's a well-built trap." "It was not built. It only grew that way. He did not have to build anything. All he had to do was be the one they owed. The wind went along the eaves and found nothing to take." Then he told her about the 11 days. He told it plainly, without decoration, the way a man tells a thing he has said to himself 10,000 times and never once out loud. The fever in the valley in the spring of 76. Eliza first, and then the child. The doctor coming from Pierre and arriving on the 9th day. He said he had built the house with 9 rooms because Eliza had wanted a house you could get lost in, and that he had been getting lost in it ever since, and that he had 140,000 acres and 19 men, and could not think of one single person who would notice for 2 days if he did not come out of the barn. I would notice. She said it before she had decided to say it. He looked at her across the stove and did not answer, and the not answering was an answer, and they sat there while the first snow of the winter came down on the valley, and neither of them said anything more that night that mattered as much as those 3 words. In the morning, the sky was scoured blue, and the world was white, and she drove home with the runners hissing, and she was 38 years old, and her ears were burning like a girl. Emmett Vance raised the flour to 11 cents in the first week of December. He did it quietly, to her alone, with the ledger open and a pencil behind his ear and a look of real sorrow on his face. Freight, he said. The rail rates. A hard winter coming and everybody would feel it. She counted out the money and carried the sack home on her hip through the snow, 20 pounds, half a mile, and she did not let herself set it down once. He raised it to 13 the following week. She went to the Bohemian family and asked whether they would sell her flour from their own stores at a fair price, and they said yes, gladly. And for 2 weeks she baked on that, until the eldest boy came around to the back of the boarding house with his hat in his hands and could not look at her and explained in broken pieces that the mercantile would no longer carry the sausage of his father. She told him to go home. She told him twice because he was crying. That night she sat on the edge of the bed with the tin from behind the stovepipe open in her lap and counted $4.60, and understood in the way you understand a thing at 11 at night in a cold room that Emmett Vance had decided she was not going to be in Bell Harrow in the spring. She could not work out why. She had thought about it for a long time before she got the shape of it, and the shape was this. A widow selling 6 loaves on a Saturday was nothing. A widow selling 90 loaves a month to the largest outfit in the county, riding out there on Wednesdays, sitting at that table, was a woman who might one day have a lawyer. The book in the bottom of her trunk had been harmless as long as she was starving. The last Saturday market before Christmas was bright and hard and cold, the kind of day that makes the whole square ring. She had made 8 loaves out of the last of the good flour and a quantity of rye she had bought off a farmer on the Bad River Road. She set them out in 2 lines of 4. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles from the cold water. Cal Hobbs came down the row a little after 10. He was a big, soft man of about 35 who had never in his life had an idea that did not come from somewhere else, and he had been drinking, and behind him at a distance of about 4 steps came Ferris Tate, who was thinner and quicker and enjoyed things more. Cal Hobbs stopped in front of her board. He looked at the 8 loaves for a while as though reading them. Stolen wheat. Hannah did not move. The market noticed. Not all at once. It went along the row the way a shadow goes over a field. That is stolen wheat, and everybody in this town knows it, and there is not one of us ought to be putting it in the mouths of our children. I buy my flour from the mercantile at 13 cents a pound, and I have the account book if you would care to look at it. He did not care to look at it. He had not come to look at anything. He leaned forward over her board and spat on the loaf nearest his hand. It was not a large thing. That was what she thought at the time, standing very still with her hands folded at her waist. It was a small, wet, insignificant thing, and it landed on the crust of a loaf she had shaped at 4:30 that morning with her mother starter and her own 2 hands, and it sat there. Ferris Tate laughed and came up beside him and spat on the second loaf, and then, because the first 2 had gone so easily, on the third. Nobody in that market said one word. 40 people, the egg women, the man with the squash, 2 members of the church board, a woman whose daughter Hannah had sat up with through a whooping cough 3 winters back. They stood in the cold sunshine among the cottonwoods, and they watched, and their silence was the loudest sound Hannah Rue Coyle ever heard in her life. She reached out and picked up the first loaf. She did not know what she meant to do with it. Later she thought she had meant to carry it home, all 8 of them, and be done, and be gone in the spring like he wanted. Set that down. The voice came from behind Cal Hobbs, and it was not loud. Josiah Kell had come into the square at some point, and nobody had marked it because everybody had been busy. He crossed the last of the ground between them, with the reins still in his left hand, and he went past Ferris Tate as though Ferris Tate were a post, and he stopped at the board. Hannah set the loaf down. He looked at it. He looked at the second and the third. Then he looked up at Cal Hobbs, and Cal Hobbs, who had been enjoying himself 30 seconds earlier, took a step backward into Ferris Tate. Josiah Kell did not touch him. He never touched either of them. He reached into his coat and brought out a leather wallet and took from it a folded banknote and laid it flat on the board beside the loaves, and everybody in that market could see that it was for $20, and $20 in Bell Harrow in December of 1884 was 3 months of wages. "I will take all 8. Mr. Kell, 3 of those have been. I know what has been done to them. I was standing right there. So were all these people." He said that last part without raising his voice at all, and he said it to the market and not to her, and 40 people looked at the ground. Then he did the thing they talked about for 9 years afterward. He picked up the loaf that Cal Hobbs had spat on. He turned it once in his hands, the way a man checks the crust. He tore it open at the middle, and the steam was long gone, but the crumb inside was pale and even and good. And he tore off a piece of that crumb and put it in his mouth and ate it, standing in the middle of the square, in front of the whole town. It went so quiet you could hear the horses shifting at the rail. He swallowed. He wiped his hands on his coat. "This is the best bread in this county, and every one of you knows it, and every one of you has stood here on a Saturday and let a woman go home with a full basket because a man who holds your paper told you a story in a hall 3 winters back." Nobody answered him. Cal Hobbs opened his mouth and Josiah Kell turned his head about 2 inches, and Cal Hobbs closed it again. "I feed 19 men through the winter and 40 in the fall, and every loaf that goes on that table from this day forward comes off this board. Mrs. Coyle, I will want 30 a week, and I will pay 8 cents, and I will pay a month in front because a woman baking on credit is a woman working for the bank." She had to say something. Her ears were roaring. "I cannot get flour." "Then we will speak about flour." And he turned around in the middle of the square and looked at the front of the mercantile, where Emmett Vance was standing in the doorway in his shirt sleeves with a pencil behind his ear, and had been standing there, it turned out, for some minutes. That was the moment the town went quiet. Not when he paid, not even when he ate. When he turned around, Emmett Vance came out from under his own sign and down the 2 steps into the cold with his hands out from his sides, wearing the expression of a reasonable man among the unreasonable. "Josiah, there is no call for a speech in the street. There is not going to be a speech. I sell flour at the rate I can get flour. The freight has gone up on everybody. You sell it to the Bohemians at 9, and you sell it to her at 13, and you told a boy of 14 years old this week that you would not carry the sausage of his father, and he came and cried in her kitchen door about it, and you did that so she would go under before the spring." The reasonable expression stayed on the face of Emmett Vance. It simply stopped connecting to anything behind it. That woman is the widow of a thief, and I have been more than patient about it. I do not believe he was. You do not have to believe. The cooperative closed the books. Josiah Kell nodded slowly, as though that were fair, as though that were the very thing he had been waiting to hear said out loud in front of 40 witnesses. Then he reached inside his coat again. The second thing he brought out was not money. It was an envelope, brown, creased across the middle from writing, and out of the envelope he took 4 sheets of paper, and he unfolded them and held them up. "I sent Ned Shifley to the rail siding at Culver Bend 3 weeks ago, and he waited 2 days for the weighmaster to come up from Chamberlain, and he paid the man $1.50 for the clerk to copy out the receiving book for the fall of 1883, every load, with the stamp, and here it is, and it is signed by the weighmaster, and it is witnessed by the station agent. Nobody moved. Mrs. Coyle has kept the hauling book of her husband in her own hand for 6 years. It sits in a trunk in a room behind the boarding house of Dorcas Pell, and it has been sitting there since December, and she brought it into your store in February, and you told her that grief makes people cling to things." Emmett Vance said nothing at all. "Every load left the scale house of this town at the weight you wrote in your own hand, and every load arrived at that siding 22 miles later at the weight the weighmaster wrote in his. And the difference across that fall is 940 bushels, and it is not spread across the season the way a leek is spread. It is on 11 days. 11 days when your own clerk was sick and you worked the counterpoise yourself." He folded the papers. "Thomas Coyle hauled full wagons. You weighed them light, and you sold the difference, and when the books came up short in November, you stood up in the Odd Fellows Hall and gave them the one man in this county who could not pay a lawyer. Somebody in the crowd said quietly, "Oh, that was all." One word, from one woman near the egg table, but it went along that market like a crack going along ice, and Hannah watched 40 faces change in the space of about 4 seconds, and she understood that they were not changing because they had heard something new. They were changing because somebody with land and cattle in a good coat had said the thing out loud, and now it was permitted. She should have hated them for that. She found, standing there with her cracked hands folded at her waist, that she mostly just felt tired. Emmett Vance turned around and went back up the 2 steps and into his store and shut the door. There was a county hearing in Fort Pierre in the 3rd week of February. It was not dramatic. Nothing about it was dramatic. There was a clerk who read numbers aloud for 2 hours in a room that smelled of wet wool, and a certified 50-pound weight from the assay office that was set on the scale at Bell Harrow in the presence of 3 men, and came up reading 46, and a hauling ledger bound in green cloth that was entered as an exhibit and handled by strangers, and returned to her in April with a paper tag tied to the spine. Emmett Vance sold the mercantile in March to a family from Yankton and moved to Sioux Falls before the finding came down. He was never tried for anything. Men like that seldom are. The cooperative issued a correction to the minutes of the December meeting of 1883, 4 sentences long, and posted it on the door of the Odd Fellows Hall, where it stayed until the wind took it in June. 4 sentences. That was the whole weight of a man life restored. Hannah went and read it twice, and then walked out to the burying ground on the rise east of town, where Thomas Coyle lay under a marker she had paid $11 for, and she stood there in the mud with the wind pulling at her bonnet, and she told him. She told him the whole of it, out loud from the beginning, the way she used to tell him about her day. Then she went home and fed the starter. The town did what towns do. It came back slowly and sideways and without ever once apologizing. The woman whose daughter had the whooping cough began buying 2 loaves a week and asking after her health with great warmth, as though there had been an illness in the family. Cal Hobbs left the county. Ferris Tate crossed the street for the rest of his life, and Hannah let him. The church board asked her to bake for the Easter supper, and she said yes, and charged them. She kept the market table, though she did not need it, because the Bohemian woman was still at the far end of the row and had never once needed to be told anything. The bread went to the valley 30 loaves a week, and then 40. And by summer, Prosper had given up the whole east end of the kitchen to her and pretended to resent it. She married Josiah Amos Kell on the 14th of September, 1885, in the front room of the house with 9 rooms, with Dorcas Pell and Ned Shifley and Prosper and the Bohemian family, and 31 ranch hands standing around in clothes they had borrowed from each other. It was not a grand wedding. She had been married grandly once, at 22, with a veil, and had learned that the size of a wedding tells you nothing whatsoever. What she remembered afterward was not the words. It was the moment near the end when he took her 2 hands in his and turned them over and looked at the knuckles, which were still cracked and which would be cracked every winter of her life, and he did not say anything about them at all. He only held them a moment longer than he needed to and then let them go. That was the whole of it. That was the man. She brought 3 things from the room behind the boarding house: the quilt her mother made, the green ledger with the county tag still tied to the spine, which she put in the bottom of the trunk in the bedroom, and which she never once opened again in 31 years, and the crock. She carried it herself, on her lap, the whole 22 miles up the North Road, because she did not trust it to the box. It went on the shelf above the flour barrel in the east end of the kitchen at the outfit, brown and heavy and chipped at the lip, in a house where the windows faced the cottonwoods along the creek. On the first morning she woke there, she came down before light out of long habit, and Prosper was not up yet, and the house with 9 rooms was quiet all the way through. She lit the lamp. She took the crock down and set it on the board, and lifted the cloth and looked at it, alive and sour and rising, older than she was, fed on a road from Ohio by a woman who had buried a child and gone on anyway. She fed it. Flour and water and warmth. Behind her she heard him on the stairs, and then he was in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, with his hair every direction, looking at her the way a man looks at a thing he has been getting used to for a year and is not used to yet. There is no call for you to be up at 4. I know it. Come sit down then. Prosper can do the bread. Prosper cannot do the bread." He laughed, rough and low, and came and sat at the end of the long table where the hands ate, and did not say anything more, and let her work. Outside the window there was nothing yet but a gray line where the prairie met the sky. She stood in the warm dark of that kitchen with her hands in the dough, folding it toward her, turning it a quarter, folding it again, and she thought about a cold square under bare cottonwoods, and 40 people saying nothing. She found she could think about it now without her chest closing. It had taken a year, because the thing they had taken from her that morning was not the bread. The bread was 5 cents. She had known that even while it was happening, standing there with her hands folded at her waist. What they had taken was the right to be looked at, and it had been taken so slowly by so many small, polite people over so many months that she had almost come to believe she had handed it over herself. And a man had crossed a square and looked straight at her and eaten it. She turned the dough. She set it in the bowl and covered it with the cloth and set it near the stove to rise. 12 loaves, then 30, then whatever the day asked for. Behind her at the long table, Josiah Kell sat with his elbows on the wood and watched her work in the lamplight in the house he had been getting lost in for 8 years. And she did not have to turn around to know it. That was the whole of what she had wanted and had not had and had stopped asking for. To be in a room, doing good work, and be seen doing it,